This is a completely fictional cinematic story created purely for entertainment purposes. All characters, organizations, locations, and events are entirely fictional. Nathaniel Cross pulled out his phone, found his wife's name on the Lumina Foundation Gala guest list, and deleted it without blinking. Then he typed in another name, Vanessa Reed, and smiled at his own reflection in the darkened screen. He had a speech to rehearse, a partnership to secure, and absolutely no room for a woman who spent her evenings staring at computer screens like she was waiting for her real life to begin. Evelyn wouldn't mind. She never did. That was the problem with marrying someone quiet. You stopped noticing them entirely, right up until the moment you couldn't afford not to. If this story finds you tonight, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far it travels. And if you stay until the end, you'll understand exactly why Nathaniel Cross should have paid closer attention to the woman he left at home. The morning it started, though Evelyn wouldn't have called it a beginning, more like a long overdue reckoning finally finding its calendar date. She was sitting at the kitchen island with her second cup of coffee going cold beside her laptop when she saw the email. It wasn't addressed to her. That was the first thing. It had been forwarded from the Lumina Foundation's event coordinator to Nathaniel's personal assistant, a woman named Brooke, who had worked for her husband for 3 years and who had, on more than one occasion, looked at Evelyn with the particular kind of careful blankness that people wear when they know something they're not supposed to know. The email had been CC'd to a shared household account that Nathaniel had set up years ago for vendor payments and catering invoices, the kind of administrative detail he'd long since stopped paying attention to. Evelyn still checked it. Old habit. The subject line read, Lumina Gala, final confirmed table seating, cross party. She almost didn't open it. She had learned over 11 years of marriage to Nathaniel Cross to be selective about which doors she opened. Some rooms you walked into and couldn't walk back out of the same way you came in. She'd gotten good at reading the weight of things before touching them. But she opened it. The confirmed party for table 4, center floor, partner tier placement, listed 2 names, Nathaniel Cross, Vanessa Reed. Evelyn sat with that for a moment, just sat with it. The way you sit with a diagnosis you half expected but still weren't prepared for. Outside the kitchen window, the city was already going about its business. A delivery truck double-parked on the street below, someone's dog pulling against a leash, a woman in a yellow coat walking fast with her head down like she was late for something important. Normal Tuesday morning in Manhattan. The world entirely indifferent to the fact that Evelyn Cade had just found out her husband had removed her from a guest list and replaced her with the woman he was sleeping with. She closed the laptop, picked up her coffee, drank it cold. Then she opened the laptop again and started making phone calls. Look, to understand what Evelyn did next, you have to understand what Evelyn was, which is something almost no one in her husband's world had ever bothered to figure out. She had met Nathaniel at 31 when she was a quiet, technically minded woman working in private sector cybersecurity consulting, and he was a rising litigation attorney with a jawline that looked borrowed from a magazine and enough ambition to fill a stadium. He was brilliant in the way that courtrooms reward. Fast, persuasive, excellent at making complex things sound simple, and simple things sound profound. She had found that attractive once. She'd mistaken confidence for depth, which was a mistake she'd made exactly once, and never again. They'd married within 18 months of meeting. She'd been in love. She thought he had been too, though she understood now that what Nathaniel had loved was the version of her that existed in those early years. The quiet woman who listened carefully and asked smart questions and made him feel, by contrast, like the most interesting person in any room. That version of her had suited him perfectly. The problem, from his perspective, was what she'd grown into. Cade Dynamics had started as a side project. That was the honest truth of it. Evelyn had no grand plan in the beginning, no vision board or 5-year roadmap. She'd simply noticed a problem in enterprise-level data security that no one else seemed to be solving with the right architecture, and she'd started solving it. In her home office. On evenings when Nathaniel was at firm events she hadn't been invited to, or client dinners that were, he explained, strictly professional in ways she'd learned not to examine too closely. She'd hired her first employee, a 26-year-old systems engineer named Dara who'd been working night shifts at a startup that was about to fold, out of the back corner of a coffee shop in Midtown. That was 7 years ago. Now Dara ran Cade Dynamics' entire technical architecture division, from the company's headquarters on the 43rd floor of a building in Hudson Yards that Evelyn owned outright. The company had grown the way that certain things grow when no one is looking, steadily, quietly, then suddenly all at once. They'd cracked a contract with the Department of Defense in year 3. Year 5 brought the first Forbes profile, which Evelyn had buried under a corporate alias with enough strategic misdirection that it never made it to Nathaniel's radar. She hadn't been hiding from embarrassment. She'd been hiding because she was tired of the performance, tired of the way her husband's eyes glazed when she talked about her work, tired of the slight smile he gave when she mentioned revenue numbers. The smile that meant "That's sweet, Evelyn. Very impressive for a hobby." She had decided, somewhere around year 4 of the company and year 7 of the marriage, that she didn't want his validation anymore. What she'd wanted was simpler and harder to name. She wanted to be known on her own terms, in her own time, without him standing in the frame taking up half the light. The separation between Evelyn Cade, the wife, and Evelyn Cade, the founder, had been deliberate and meticulously maintained. Different email addresses. A legal team that operated under strict NDAs. Board members who understood, without ever being told directly, that her personal life was not a subject of discussion. Her professional world knew almost nothing about Nathaniel Cross. His world knew almost nothing about hers. She'd kept those two rooms sealed from each other for years. The email changed the math. She called Marcus first. Marcus Webb was Cade Dynamics' chief strategy officer, a compact, sharp-eyed man from Atlanta who had a gift for reading situations and an even better gift for staying calm inside them. He picked up on the second ring. "I need to talk to you about the Lumina Foundation Gala," Evelyn said. A pause. "The philanthropy event? The one in 3 weeks?" "Right." She could hear him adjusting in his chair. "What about it?" "I want Cade Dynamics to become the principal sponsor." Silence. Then, "Evelyn, the window for... I know when the window closed. I need you to open it anyway. Find out who the current principal sponsor is and what it would take to buy into that position. Don't ask me why right now." Another pause. Longer this time. Marcus had worked with her for 5 years. He'd learned to recognize the difference between her calm and her calm. "Is this personal?" he asked carefully. "Everything is personal eventually," she said. "Make the calls." She hung up before he could answer. The next 3 weeks were a study in parallel realities. In Nathaniel's reality, life was excellent. The Lumina Gala was shaping up to be the exact kind of social event that could cement his standing with the 3 senior partners whose votes would determine whether he became the youngest managing partner in the firm's history. He was 51 years old, and he'd spent 30 years in rooms where other people's names were on the doors, and he was done with that. The gala was perfect. 300 of Manhattan's most influential people, a foundation with genuine prestige, and his name attached to something that mattered beyond the courtroom. Vanessa was an asset he'd spent considerable time cultivating. She was 37, worked in financial consulting, and had the particular social fluency that Evelyn had never bothered to develop. The ability to work a room, to remember names and anniversaries and whose children were at which schools, to laugh at the right moments and ask the right questions. She was good at this life in ways that Evelyn had simply refused to be. He told himself that removing Evelyn from the list had been a practical decision. She wouldn't have enjoyed it anyway. She would have stood at the edge of conversations, quiet and slightly uncomfortable, and he'd have spent half the night managing her presence instead of working the room. It was better this way, cleaner. He didn't think about it again. In Evelyn's reality, things were moving differently. Marcus had come back to her within 48 hours. The current principal sponsor, a commercial real estate group whose lead partner had just announced a surprise retirement, had been willing to negotiate. What followed was a financial transaction that would have required a different kind of person to complete without flinching. Evelyn did not flinch. She authorized the transfer from her personal holdings account, reviewed the sponsorship contract that her attorney had restructured from the ground up, and signed the agreement on a Wednesday afternoon between 2 other scheduled meetings. Cade Dynamics was now the principal sponsor of the Lumina Foundation Gala. Her name would be on every program. Her company's branding would frame the ballroom entrance. When the foundation president stood at the podium to open the evening, the first words out of his mouth would be about Cade Dynamics and the woman who had built it. She told no one in Nathaniel's orbit. She didn't adjust her behavior at home. She made dinner twice that week, asked politely about his caseload, listened while he talked about the gala with the distracted enthusiasm of someone already rehearsing their own highlight reel. She nodded in the right places. She went to bed when he did. She was, by every visible measure, exactly the woman he believed her to be. The week before the gala, Evelyn's team at Cade Dynamics had been working around the clock on something else entirely, a product launch that had been in development for 19 months. A next-generation enterprise security platform built on a proprietary architecture that her engineering team had spent the better part of 2 years stress testing against every known vulnerability framework in existence. The launch had been scheduled for Q1 of the following year. Evelyn moved it up. "You want to announce at the gala?" Dara had asked, sitting across from her in the conference room, coffee in hand, expression carefully neutral in the way that meant she had opinions but was waiting to be asked. "Not at the gala," Evelyn said. "After, same night. Timed for midnight, when the evening coverage is still running." Dara took a slow sip of her coffee. "The press package is ready. We'd need the technical demo briefings finished by Friday." "Are they?" "They will be." Then we're on." Dara nodded, then added quietly, because they'd known each other long enough for that. "Is everything okay?" Evelyn considered the question honestly, the way she did when she was in a room where honesty was safe. "No," she said, "but it will be." On the Thursday before the gala, she went shopping, not the way she usually shopped, quickly, practically, with a specific thing in mind and an efficient exit strategy. This time, she gave herself 2 hours and went to an atelier in the West Village that a colleague had recommended years ago, and she'd never gotten around to visiting. The designer, a French woman named Celeste, who was approximately 70 years old and looked like she'd personally outlasted several empires, took one look at Evelyn and said, "What do you need this dress to do?" Evelyn liked her immediately. "I need it to be the last thing a room full of people sees before they understand they've had me wrong for years," Evelyn said. Celeste nodded, unsurprised, and disappeared into the back. She came out with black silk threaded through with silver. Not decorative silver, structural silver, the kind that caught light the way water catches it, from unexpected angles, always moving. The gown had a clean architectural line at the shoulder and fell to the floor with the quiet authority of something that didn't need to explain itself. Evelyn stood in front of the mirror for a long moment. She looked like herself. That was the thing that surprised her. Not transformed, not costumed, but more precisely herself than she'd looked in years. Like the version of her that had always been there, waiting for the occasion that was large enough to warrant showing up in full. "Yes," she said. Celeste smiled like she'd expected that answer. On the Friday before the event, Nathaniel came home late, loosened his tie in the hallway, and found Evelyn at the kitchen island with her laptop open, the same position he'd left her in that morning. He didn't ask what she was working on. He never did. "Big week coming up," he said, opening the refrigerator. She said. "The gala should be good. Important for the firm." He said this without looking at her, which was a habit she'd noticed years ago and had stopped expecting to change. "I'm sure it will be," she said. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter. "I might be home late that night, depending on how the evening goes." "Of course," she said, still not looking up from the screen. He watched her for a moment, the clean, unremarkable domestic image of his wife at her computer, and then took his water and went upstairs. Evelyn waited until she heard his footsteps on the upper landing. Then she let herself smile, just briefly, at her reflection in the darkened kitchen window. She had been patient for a very long time. 3 more days. The Saturday before the gala, Nathaniel Cross stood in front of the full-length mirror in the master bedroom and practiced being humble. It was something he'd gotten genuinely good at over the years. The particular performance of modesty that powerful men deploy in rooms full of other powerful men, the slight downward tilt of the head when someone praises you, the self-deprecating half-smile that says, "I know, but let's not make a thing of it." He'd been doing it since law school, when he'd figured out that visible ambition made people nervous, but visible competence wrapped in apparent humility made them want to help you. It was one of the more useful things he'd ever learned. He adjusted his cufflinks. Italian silver. He'd bought them himself, which was a thing he'd started doing about 4 years ago when he realized that Evelyn had stopped paying attention to those details. Early in their marriage, she'd been thoughtful about gifts, small things, well chosen, that suggested she'd been listening. A particular book, a bottle of scotch from a distillery she remembered him mentioning once at dinner, the cufflinks she'd given him for their 5th anniversary, simple brushed gold with his initials, which he'd quietly retired to the back of a drawer when they started to feel like an accusation. He didn't examine that thought for long. Downstairs, Evelyn was in her office. He could hear the faint sound of her keyboard, which was the ambient soundtrack of their marriage. Her typing away at whatever she typed at, him moving through rooms she happened to also occupy. He'd stopped asking about her work years ago, partly because the answers made him feel like he was being given a tour of a foreign country he had no particular interest in visiting, and partly because something in her face when she talked about it had started to make him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't name and preferred not to examine. He took his jacket from the dry cleaning bag, shook out the shoulders, put it on. The gala was in 6 days. He was going to become the youngest managing partner in Hartwell Briggs and Cross's history. Cross was already in the name, had been for 3 years, which still gave him a quiet, private satisfaction. And this event was the last social piece of that puzzle. Senior partners watched these things. How you moved in a room, who knew you, who came to find you versus who you had to go find. It was all information, and the partners at Hartwell Briggs processed social information the way they processed legal briefs, carefully, with long memories and specific conclusions. Vanessa understood that. She'd asked intelligent questions about the firm's culture, about which partners mattered most and for what reasons, about the foundation itself. She'd done research. He appreciated that. It was the kind of preparation that Evelyn would never have bothered with, not because she was incapable of it, but because she'd never seemed to care about the things that mattered to him in any sustained, effortful way. That was the story he told himself. He was very good at stories. But Evelyn was not in fact typing when Nathaniel passed her office door that morning. She was on a video call with the Lumina Foundation's event director, a man named Philip Okafor, who had organized the gala for the past 6 consecutive years, and who had, in the 10 days since Cade Dynamics had come aboard as principal sponsor, developed a visible and slightly awed regard for Evelyn that she found both useful and faintly exhausting. "The program revision is finalized," Philip said, pulling up a document on his screen. "Your company's name leads the cover. The opening remarks will credit Cade Dynamics before anything else. And the entrance sequence," he paused. "Are you certain about the timing on that?" "I want the announcement made before I walk in," Evelyn said. "Not after. It's a bit unusual." "Philip," she kept her voice even, "is it possible?" "Yes, technically, yes." "Then that's how we do it." He made a note. "The foundation president will speak your name directly. Is there anything specific you'd like him to say?" "Just the truth," she said. "What the company does, what it's built. Nothing embellished." Philip nodded, then hesitated with the expression of someone who had something else on their mind. "Ms. Cade, there are a few attendees on the confirmed list who are registered as guests of Hartwell Briggs & Cross. The firm has a table." "I know," she said. "One of the partners, Mr. Cross." "I know who he is, Philip." A beat of silence. "Of course. I just wanted to make sure there won't be any complications," she said. "Leave the seating as it is for now. I may have a small adjustment to request closer to the evening." "Of course." He wrote something down. "Anything else? Make sure the AV team has the Cade Dynamics product reel loaded and tested by the afternoon of the event. I want a clean version, no technical surprises." "Absolutely. Thank you, Philip." She ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of her office, a room that Nathaniel had walked past 10,000 times without ever stepping fully inside, which she had long ago stopped registering as anything other than a neutral fact about the architecture of their marriage. The walls held framed schematics from Cade Dynamics' first government contract, a whiteboard covered in a notation system she'd developed herself, which looked to the uninitiated like organized chaos, a shelf of technical manuals beside a single-framed photograph of her and Dara at the company's first real office, a converted 2-room space in a building that smelled permanently of someone else's lunch. She had built this. Every inch of it, while the man down the hall built his own version of success and assumed they were the only kind worth having. She opened her laptop and pulled up the product launch brief. 19 months. That was how long the team had been working on Secure Grid, and even that name felt inadequate for what it actually was. A fully adaptive, AI-integrated enterprise security architecture that didn't just defend against known threat patterns, but predicted and neutralized emerging ones in real time. The Department of Defense contract had been the proof of concept. What was coming next week was the commercial launch, and the commercial launch was going to change the conversation about what private sector security infrastructure could look like. She'd scheduled the press release for 11:55 p.m. on the night of the gala. She wasn't sure yet whether that was calculated or simply satisfying. Probably both. She'd made peace with the fact that some of her decisions were driven by things less clean than pure strategy, and she found that honesty easier to live with than the alternative. Marcus Webb arrived at her office building in Hudson Yards at 11 on Monday morning with 2 coffees and the expression of a man who had been doing the math on something and hadn't finished deciding how he felt about it. He set 1 coffee in front of her, sat down. "The press registrations for the launch are coming in strong," he said. "Tech press, obviously. But I'm seeing interest from financial media, too. Wall Street Journal sent a confirmation this morning. Bloomberg's registered 2 reporters. Good. The Lumina Foundation tie-in is going to be impossible to ignore," he continued. "When the announcement drops at midnight with your name already all over the gala coverage." He stopped. "You planned this as a single event, didn't you? The sponsorship and the launch. It's one move." "It's several moves," Evelyn said. "But yes." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee. "Does this have something to do with Nathaniel?" She had always appreciated that about Marcus. The directness. He didn't construct elaborate pretexts for the things he actually wanted to say. "The gala does," she said. "The product launch is on its own timeline. The timing is mine." He doesn't know about any of this. "No." Marcus absorbed that. "Okay." He turned a page in the folder. "I need you to know that the legal team flagged one potential issue with the sponsorship agreement. There's a disclosure clause that requires the sponsor's principal officer to be identified in any media produced for the event, which means your name is going to be on record in Lumina's press materials before the night even starts." "I know. If Nathaniel or anyone at his firm does any basic research on the sponsor, they won't," she said. "He won't. I know how he prepares for things." Marcus looked at her steadily. "And if you're wrong?" She thought about it honestly. "Then the surprise is slightly smaller," she said. "It doesn't change the outcome." He nodded slowly. "All right, I just want to make sure we've walked the whole board." "We have. One more thing." He hesitated. "The table arrangement at the gala. Philip Okafor's office called me this morning. Apparently you mentioned a potential seating adjustment. I'll handle that directly with Philip." "Evelyn, Marcus." She said it gently, but with enough weight that he heard the boundary. "I'll handle it." He let it go, the way he'd learned to let certain things go. They spent the next 2 hours in the weeds of the product launch sequence, the press strategy, the partner briefings, the technical demo schedule. It was the kind of work she loved most. Granular, specific, consequential. The work where competence was the only currency that mattered. By 1 o'clock, when Marcus stood up to leave, he paused at the door. "For what it's worth," he said, "I've been working with you for 5 years. I've watched you make 100 decisions. Some of them I agreed with, some of them I didn't." He looked at her steadily. "This one feels right." She looked up from her notes. "You don't know all of it." "I know enough," he said, and left. She and Nathaniel had dinner together that Tuesday night, which was unusual enough that she registered it. He'd come home at a reasonable hour, which sometimes happened when he was in a good mood and wanted company for it, and he'd suggested they order from the Italian place 2 blocks over that they'd been going to since their 3rd year of marriage. It had been a place they both actually liked, which was a smaller category than it sounded. The food arrived. They ate at the kitchen table rather than the dining room, which was a marker of relative informality, the kind of small domestic negotiation that long-married people conduct without words. "Deposition went well today," Nathaniel said, gesturing slightly with his fork. Reardon's team was not prepared, which I knew they wouldn't be, but it's still satisfying when you're right. Was Reardon there himself? He was. Watched the whole thing. You could see when he realized his own witness was going to sink them. Nathaniel smiled at the memory of it. The particular smile he got when he'd won something, different from his social smile, more unguarded. She'd always been able to tell the two apart. That must have felt good, she said. It did. He poured himself more wine. How was your day? The question was reflexive. She'd understood that for years. He asked it the way you say fine before someone finishes asking how you are, as a social gesture rather than an actual inquiry. But tonight, for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, she answered it differently. Productive, she said. We finalized the launch timeline on a project I've been working on for almost 2 years. He looked up with the polite interest of someone preparing to listen for exactly as long as felt considerate. Yeah, what kind of project? Security architecture, she said. Enterprise level. The kind of infrastructure that covers gaps in threat response that most organizations don't even know they have yet. He nodded slowly. So consulting work? She picked up her wine glass. Something like that. Good for you, he said, warmly enough, in the tone that had once been one of his better qualities. The tone that made people feel seen even when he was only briefly paying attention. You've always been good at that stuff. She smiled at him across the table. You have no idea, she thought, with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, something further along than both. They talked about other things after that. A mutual friend's new apartment, a restaurant that had just closed in their neighborhood. The easy, surface-level conversation of two people who had long since stopped navigating toward depth with each other, who had settled without formal agreement into the shallower waters where things were quieter and nothing unexpected came up from the bottom. He fell asleep on the couch that night watching something on television. She covered him with a blanket, not from tenderness exactly, but from the plain domestic habit of it, the muscle memory of a life they'd built together that was ending slowly and hadn't fully understood that yet. She stood over him for a moment. 11 years. They hadn't been uniformly bad. There had been good years, genuinely good ones, when they'd been enough for each other, when his ambition had felt like energy she could borrow, and her steadiness had felt like ground he could stand on. Somewhere in the middle of it, those qualities had curdled into something else. His ambition had become a consuming thing that left no room for anything that didn't serve it. Her steadiness had become, in his reading of her, passivity, absence of ambition, a woman with no stakes. He was wrong about that. He had always been wrong about that. She turned off the television and went to bed. Thursday arrived with the particular pressure of things that can't be undone. Evelyn was in the office by 7, which was earlier than usual, working through the final product brief revisions with Dara and 2 members of the engineering team. The demo was clean, the press package was tight, the announcement video, 3 minutes and 40 seconds of technical elegance that Dara had overseen with the same obsessive precision she applied to everything, was exactly what it needed to be. Walk me through the platform name one more time, Evelyn said. Dara pulled up the final brand guidelines on her tablet. Secure Grid Apex. The Apex differentiator signals it's above the existing Secure Grid framework, which the market knows, even if they only know it by reputation. It creates continuity and elevation at the same time. And the tagline? Built for what's coming. Evelyn looked at it, nodded once. Good. They spent 2 more hours in the room going through scenarios. What if a reporter asked about government partnerships before the DoD agreement was fully declassified? What if a competitor preempted the announcement? What if the technical demo had a single failure point during the live press window? Evelyn had answers for all of it, and for the things she didn't have answers for, she had contingencies. She had always been better at contingencies than most people, which was part of what made her good at security in the first place, the ability to think like a threat. After the team dispersed, Dara stayed. She sat across from Evelyn with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had gone cold and said, "You're not nervous." "No," Evelyn said. "I'm a little nervous," Dara admitted. "For the record." "That's useful. Nervous people catch things." Dara smiled briefly. "Are you going to tell me what's happening Saturday with the gala?" Evelyn had told Dara more about her personal life than she'd told almost anyone, which still wasn't much. But Dara had been there from the beginning. She'd watched the company grow from a 2-person operation in a rented room into what it was now, and she'd watched Evelyn navigate the years in between with the close attention of someone who'd earned the right to notice. He doesn't know about any of it, Evelyn said. The sponsorship, the company, any of it. Dara was quiet for a moment. How is that possible? I made choices, Evelyn said simply, to keep things separate. For a long time it was about protecting the work. Then it became about something else. What? Wanting to be discovered on my own terms. She said it without drama. I was tired of being seen through his frame. I wanted, just once, to walk into a room where people knew who I was because of what I'd built, not because of who I'd married. Dara looked at her steadily. Saturday's that room. Saturday's that room, Evelyn agreed. Another silence, different in texture. Dara said, Is the dress ready? Despite everything, Evelyn laughed, a short, real laugh that surprised her. Yes, the dress is ready. Good. Dara finished her cold coffee. Then we're ready. Gum. The day before the gala, Evelyn did something she hadn't done in nearly 2 years. She called her sister. Ruth Cade lived in Portland, Oregon, and was 3 years older and approximately 1,000 times less interested in managing other people's perceptions of her, which had always been both her greatest freedom and the thing that had made their mother slightly exhausted. She was a landscape architect who had been married to the same man for 20 years and who had, on numerous occasions over the course of Evelyn's marriage to Nathaniel, said things that Evelyn hadn't been ready to hear. Hey, Ruth said, picking up with the slightly suspicious tone of someone who'd learned that unexpected calls meant something was happening. What's going on? I wanted to talk to you before tomorrow night, Evelyn said. Tomorrow night. There's an event, a gala. Nathaniel is going. A pause. Are you? Yes. Ruth was quiet for a moment, which meant she was parsing. He doesn't know you're going? He doesn't know several things, Evelyn said. Evie, Ruth's voice dropped into the register she used when she was being honest without being unkind, which was a skill she'd developed late and wielded carefully. What are you doing? What I should have done years ago. That's not an answer. I'm not hiding anymore, Evelyn said. I built something real. I built something significant, and I've been keeping it invisible because I was tired of him making me feel small about it. And then at some point, invisible became the plan because I figured out what the alternative looked like. She stopped. Tomorrow night is the alternative. Ruth was quiet again. Then, is this going to hurt you? It's going to change things. That's not what I asked. Evelyn thought about it. The honest answer was layered. There was the pain that was already there, that had been there since the email with the guest list, since long before that. The slow erosion of a marriage that had started to fail years before either of them had been willing to call it by name. Tomorrow wasn't creating that hurt. It was simply bringing it into the light. I'm going to be okay, she said. I think I've been building toward okay for a long time. Ruth made a sound that was halfway between a sigh and something softer. Are you wearing something good? Yes. Tell me about the dress. So Evelyn told her about the dress. The black silk, the silver threading that moved with the light, Celeste's question about what she needed it to do, and her own answer. And Ruth listened, and for a few minutes it felt like nothing more than two sisters talking, which was one of the last completely uncomplicated things Evelyn had left. Call me Sunday, Ruth said before they hung up. Not a text, a call. I will. And Evie? Yeah? You were never invisible, Ruth said. He just had his eyes closed. That night, Evelyn laid the gown out across the chair in her dressing room. She checked her phone for the final product launch confirmation from the PR team, replied with a single-word approval, and set the alarm for 6 the next morning, even though she knew she wouldn't sleep past 4. She stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the city. Manhattan at midnight was a specific kind of alive, never fully quiet, always moving at some lower frequency underneath the surface noise, the grid of lights extending in every direction like a system that refused to shut down. She had come to the city at 28 with a head full of technical theory and a conviction that the way things were built could always be improved. That conviction had not diminished. If anything, it had sharpened, refined itself over years of application, become more specific and therefore more useful. She thought about what Ruth had said. He just had his eyes closed. The charitable reading of Nathaniel Cross, the one she had held on to longer than she should have, was that he was a man shaped by a world that had rewarded a very particular performance of success, and that performing it convincingly had eventually cost him the ability to see outside its frame. That he had genuinely not understood what was growing in the rooms he'd walked past every day. Because the rooms he'd walked past every day had never given him reason to look. She wasn't sure she believed that anymore. She turned away from the window. Tomorrow, Manhattan would see her clearly. She was going to let it. She was awake at 3:47. Not with a jolt, not with anxiety crawling up through the chest the way it sometimes does before big things. She simply opened her eyes and the room was dark, and she was completely, calmly awake, the way she'd been before every significant moment of her professional life. Before the DoD contract presentation, before the Series B close, before the first time she'd stood in front of a room full of people who mattered and told them what she'd built and watched them understand that it was real. She lay still for a few minutes, listening to Nathaniel breathe beside her. He slept the way he did everything, with total conviction, undisturbed. She had spent years envying that about him, the ability to shut the door between the day and sleep with such clean efficiency. Her own mind didn't work that way. It ran background processes constantly, chewing on unresolved problems, returning to half-finished thoughts the way a tongue finds a sore spot. She'd learned to work with that rather than against it, to treat the pre-dawn hours as time rather than insomnia. She got up without waking him. In the kitchen, she made coffee and stood at the window while it brewed. The city was doing its 4 a.m. thing, quieter than it ever got, but never actually quiet. A garbage truck somewhere 2 blocks over, the distant accordion sound of a bus door, yellow cabs cutting through intersections where the lights changed for nobody. She'd always felt a particular kinship with the city at this hour. Something about the way it kept moving even when it thought no one was watching. She poured her coffee and sat at the kitchen island with her phone and went through the overnight messages from the PR team. The press release was locked. The technical briefing documents had been distributed to registered media under embargo. The product demo sequence had been tested 3 times on the conference room setup and twice more remotely. Dara had sent a voice memo at 2 a.m. She'd clearly not slept either, confirming that the AV contact at the Lumina venue had received and loaded the Cade Dynamics reel. Everything was in position. She set the phone down and drank her coffee in the quiet, not thinking about anything in particular, letting the morning be what it was before it became what it was going to be. Nathaniel's day started at 8 with the sound of his own alarm and a mood that Evelyn clocked immediately as performance ready. The particular energy he carried when he was headed toward something he'd been building to. He moved through the apartment with the focused efficiency of a man running an internal checklist, showered and dressed, while she made breakfast. 8 standing at the counter with his phone in one hand, going through emails. "What are your plans today?" he asked, not entirely rhetorically. The question was more like conversation filler while he scrolled. "Errands," she said. "Some things at the office." He nodded, reading something on his screen. "I'm going into the office this morning, then I'll head straight to the venue from there. Cocktail hour starts at 7. "Okay," she said. "Don't wait up." He said it lightly, with the ease of someone who'd said it many times. "It'll be a late one." She handed him his coffee. "Have a good night." He took it, looked at her briefly with something that might have been, in a different version of this marriage, a moment of actual contact. A look that lasted long enough to mean something. But it didn't quite get there. His eyes were already moving back to his phone. "You too," he said, and kissed her once on the cheek with the absent precision of long habit. She watched him go down the hallway, heard the closet open and close, heard the front door. Then she finished her own coffee, rinsed both cups, and went to get ready. She arrived at Cade Dynamics at 10 and spent 3 hours in back-to-back internal briefings, moving through the sequence with the methodical focus that her team had come to recognize as her game day mode, present in each room, each conversation, not letting the evening's other gravity pull her attention sideways. There were things to manage, real things, independent of whatever was going to happen at the Lumina Foundation ballroom in 9 hours. The platform launch was real. The company was real. That had always been the foundation everything else was built on. At 1 o'clock, Dara appeared in her doorway with a takeout bag and the expression of someone conducting a welfare check. "Eat," Dara said, setting the bag on her desk. "You've had nothing since this morning." "How do you know what I've had since this morning?" Because I know you. Dara sat down across from her. Also because Meredith at the front desk told me you walked past the kitchen twice and didn't take anything. Evelyn opened the bag. Soup, a sandwich, water. Meredith's reporting to you now? Everyone reports to me on days like this. It's unofficial, but understood. Dara watched her unwrap the sandwich. How are you? Ready. That's not the same as okay. No, Evelyn agreed. But it'll do. They ate together in the office, talking through the evening's logistics, the timing of the launch announcement, the media response protocol, the ordinary work of the thing, the machinery of it, which was comforting in its specificity. By 2:30, they'd covered everything that could be covered. Dara stood to leave, then paused. You know the team wants to be somewhere they can see the gala coverage, right? There's about 12 people who've requested to work late tonight for, and I quote, monitoring purposes. Evelyn looked up. Tell them to go home. They won't. Tell them anyway. She paused. And tell them thank you. Dara smiled. I'll tell them the second part. She went home at 3:30. The apartment was quiet in the specific way it is when you know someone who was in it is not coming back to it the same way. She walked through the rooms without any particular ceremony. The living room with its careful art and its good furniture. The kitchen where she'd had 1,000 ordinary mornings. The hallway where Nathaniel had kissed her cheek 5 hours ago, with the practiced ease of a man who no longer meant it. She went to the bedroom and stood in front of the mirror for a moment before she started getting ready. What looked back at her was a woman of 42 who had not slept more than 5 hours, whose eyes were calm and slightly tired, who had spent the better part of a decade building something enormous in the margins of a life that didn't see her. Not a transformation, not a before and after, just herself, standing there, aware of the weight of the day and not collapsing under it. She got in the shower, let the water run hot for longer than was probably necessary. Then she sat at the vanity and took her time. She was not a woman who spent hours on appearances. She'd always found that kind of maintenance slightly tedious, the way it demanded a level of self-consciousness that pulled you out of your own thoughts. But tonight she understood what Celeste had meant when she asked what the dress needed to do. The answer had been the last thing a room full of people sees before they understand they've had me wrong for years. And that required a specific kind of attention to the details. She took care with her hair, with the choice of earrings, simple platinum drops, architectural, the kind of thing that didn't draw attention to itself but held up under scrutiny. With the small decisions that accumulate into a version of yourself that you're prepared to be seen in, that you won't want to dismantle at the end of the night and wonder if it was all performance. At 6:15, she put on the gown. The silver threading caught the bedroom light and moved with her when she turned, the way Celeste had promised it would. Not flashy, but alive in a way that understated things tend to be when they're made with real skill. She stood in front of the full-length mirror and looked at herself for a long moment. She thought about Nathaniel standing in this same mirror that morning, practicing his humble smile. She didn't practice anything. She picked up her phone, called for the car, and walked out. The Lumina Foundation Gala was held at the Caldwell, a venue in Midtown that had been doing this kind of event for 40 years. The building had the particular confidence of places that have watched enough powerful people walk through their doors to stop being impressed by any single one of them. The main ballroom occupied the entire third floor, its ceilings high enough that the sound of 300 people talking never became overwhelming, the lighting designed to make everyone look slightly better than they actually did, which was a form of social lubrication that event planners had understood for centuries. By 7 o'clock, the room was filling steadily. Nathaniel arrived at 7:10 with Vanessa on his arm and the energy of a man who had already decided the evening was going to go well. He'd worn the navy suit, not the black, which read too formal, but not the lighter gray either, which the more senior partners occasionally teased as optimistic. The navy was the considered choice, which was the only kind of choice he made on nights that mattered. Vanessa was in a deep burgundy dress with a neckline that managed to be both notable and defensible, which she'd clearly thought about. She looked well. She moved well. When the first person they encountered, Gerald Marsh, third senior partner at Hartwell Briggs, a man of 64 who had opinions about everything and expressed most of them, turned to greet them, Vanessa shook his hand and said something that made him laugh within 30 seconds, which was exactly the right outcome. Nathaniel felt good. He took a glass of champagne from a passing tray and surveyed the room with the particular pleasure of a man who has positioned himself well and knows it. He could see the Hartwell-Briggs table near center floor. Table 4, the placement he'd specifically requested, close enough to the action that the partner's presence registered, but with enough space to breathe. He could see the foundation president, Arthur Delacroix, working the room near the far end, the white-haired patrician figure who ran Lumina with a combination of genuine idealism and old-money social instinct that had made the foundation one of the most genuinely respected charitable institutions in the city. He could see various other faces he recognized: a city councilwoman, 2 hedge fund managers he'd worked with on separate matters, the CEO of a media company whose litigation Hartwell-Briggs had handled for 15 years. The room was exactly what he'd needed it to be. "It's a beautiful venue," Vanessa said beside him, making the assessment practical as well as social, registering exits and sightlines, he noticed, which was one of her better qualities. "It is," he agreed. "Lumina does this well." He nodded toward the far side of the room. "See the man in the charcoal suit near the windows? That's Harold Briggs, senior founding partner, 81 years old, still comes to 3 of these a year. Should we go say hello? Give it 20 minutes. Let the room settle. You don't want to be the first person to work Harold. He likes to do the choosing." Vanessa absorbed this without visible reaction, which was one of the things he appreciated about her. She learned quickly and didn't need things explained twice. They moved through the cocktail hour, making the right stops, having the right conversations. Gerald Marsh lingered with them longer than expected, which was a good sign. A partner from a competing firm made a point of complimenting Nathaniel's handling of a recent high-profile arbitration loudly enough that 2 Hartwell-Briggs associates nearby could hear it, which was the kind of third-party validation that no amount of self-promotion could replicate. By 7:45, Nathaniel could feel the evening assembling itself around him the way successful evenings do, moment by moment, click by click. He didn't think about Evelyn once. At 7:55, Arthur Delacroix made his way to the podium at the front of the room to welcome the guests and begin the formal transition into the dinner portion of the evening. The crowd settled, the particular gradual settling of a room that has been social and is adjusting itself toward attention, the conversations lowering and then quieting as Delacroix tapped the microphone once. He was good at this. 72 years old, the voice of a man who'd spent decades being listened to, who understood the difference between a room that was quiet because it had to be and a room that was quiet because it wanted to be. "Good evening," he said, and got the second kind of quiet. Nathaniel found their seats at table 4, settled in, reached for his water. Delacroix spoke warmly about the Lumina Foundation's work, the projects the Gala's proceeds would support, the partnerships that made it possible. The usual architecture of these openings, well executed. Nathaniel listened with half his attention while the other half tracked the room, which partners were at which tables, who was seated with whom, the social geometry of the evening as it solidified into dinner arrangements. Then Delacroix said, "This year, we have the honor of welcoming a principal sponsor whose work has changed the landscape of an entire industry. A company that has quietly become one of the most consequential technology ventures in America, and whose founder, I will say from personal experience, is the kind of person who makes you reconsider your assumptions about what one human being can build." Something in the room shifted. A subtle thing. A slight increase in attention. The way people lean forward by half an inch when something has their genuine interest. Nathaniel reached for his champagne. "Cade Dynamics," Delacroix said, "has been the force behind some of the most significant advances in enterprise security architecture of the last decade. Their technology protects systems that most of us depend on without knowing it. Federal infrastructure, private financial networks, health systems, communication grids. They have been working at a level most of the world didn't know existed." Nathaniel's hand stopped on the champagne glass. Something cold moved through him. Not recognition. Not yet. Just the first hair-thin fracture of a feeling he couldn't name. Cade. It was a common enough name. It meant nothing. "And tonight," Delacroix continued, "we are privileged to have their founder with us, a woman who built this company from a 2-person consulting operation into a global force, who has never once sought the spotlight, and who chose to be here tonight because she believes in what this foundation does for the city. He paused, turned toward the main entrance at the far end of the ballroom. Please welcome, Delacroix said, the founder and chief executive of Cade Dynamics, Evelyn Cade. The doors opened. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds, and would be the thing that several people in that room described in various conversations over the following weeks as the most striking entrance they'd ever witnessed at one of these events. And these were people who attended a great many of these events and had developed a sophisticated resistance to being struck by things. She walked in wearing the black gown with the silver threading and the Caldwell's ballroom lighting, which had been designed by someone who understood what it was for, caught the silver and moved it, so that she seemed to arrive not from the doorway exactly, but from some directional shift in the room's own atmosphere. She was not hurrying, she was not performing. She simply walked in like a woman who had decided to arrive, which was different from a woman who was making an entrance, and the difference was legible to everyone in the room in a way that no one could have fully articulated. The applause started at the tables nearest the entrance and moved inward. Not the polite, rhythmic applause of obligation, but the faster, more chaotic kind that happens when people are responding to something before they've decided to. A CEO near the front rose to his feet, then the woman beside him. Then, in the spreading way of these things, the standing moved outward through the room like a tide finding its level. 300 people. Evelyn walked toward the front of the room at the same pace she'd started with, acknowledging the room with a nod, a slight smile. Not overwhelmed, not performing gratitude, just present. Her eyes moved across tables with the calm sweep of someone who had expected to be seen and had decided how she felt about it. She reached the head table. She sat down. Nathaniel Cross had not moved. He sat with his champagne glass halfway to his mouth, and his face arranged in the expression of a man whose brain is processing an input that his assumptions have no architecture to receive. His mouth had opened slightly. His eyes were fixed on the woman now seated 6 feet to his left, who was his wife, who was wearing a gown that cost more than his first car, who was being applauded by standing ovation by everyone in the room. Including, he registered with a specific kind of horror, Harold Briggs, who was 81 years old and had remained seated at every event Nathaniel had ever attended with him, without exception. Vanessa, beside him, had gone very still. "Nathaniel?" she said quietly. He didn't answer. "Who is that?" she asked, even more quietly. He set the champagne glass down carefully. His hand was not entirely steady. "That's my wife," he said. The silence that followed was the specific kind that two people generate when neither of them has any available words for what they're sitting inside. Evelyn, for her part, had seen him the moment she walked through the doors. He was hard to miss. Table 4, center floor, exactly where she'd known he'd be, because she knew how he thought about these things, what placement meant to him, what he'd have asked for, and why. He was in the Navy suit, which she could have predicted also. He'd had it tailored 2 years ago and wore it to events he considered important, and she had not told him that the Navy worked better for him than the black, because by that point she'd stopped offering those kinds of observations, and he'd stopped noticing whether she made them. She had seen the glass stop moving toward his mouth. She had watched his face perform the thing that faces do when the world doesn't match the model it's been operating on, the brief system failure before the scrambling begins. She'd watched it for the 2 seconds she'd allowed herself to look at him, and then she'd looked away, back to Arthur Delacroix, who was extending his hand to welcome her to the podium for a brief acknowledgement, and she'd taken his hand and stood and said a few words into the microphone. Thank you to the foundation, something genuine about the city, a sentence about what it meant to be in a room full of people who put money behind the things they claimed to believe in. And she'd done it with the steadiness of someone who had been preparing for this moment in one form or another for years. She returned to her seat. Around her, conversations resumed, the room moving back into its dinner rhythms. Waitstaff began moving between tables. The ambient sound of the evening reassembled itself. Arthur Delacroix leaned toward her from her right. "Beautifully done, Evelyn. You've given us the best opening in 6 years." "You did most of the work," she said. "I read what was written. You built what I was describing." He raised his glass. "Welcome to the room." She raised hers in return. To her left, 6 feet away, Nathaniel Cross sat with his champagne untouched, the color of a man trying very hard to look like he was managing something that was, in fact, managing him. Across the table, she could see Gerald Marsh, silver-haired, sharp-eyed Gerald, who had known Nathaniel for 20 years and who was now looking at Nathaniel with the particular expression of a man recalculating a spreadsheet he thought he'd already balanced. Gerald Marsh looked from Nathaniel to Evelyn. Evelyn caught his eye briefly and nodded, once, pleasantly, the way you acknowledge someone you've met before at an event where you now happen to be the most important person in the room. Gerald nodded back, looked at Nathaniel again, said nothing. Nathaniel picked up his champagne and drank half of it. The dinner service began. The first course arrived and the tables settled into conversation, which was the social grace of these events, the way the machinery of dinner absorbs the awkward and the significant alike and keeps moving. Evelyn spoke to the guests on either side of her, a biotech executive named Constance, who'd been a Lumina donor for 12 years and who asked intelligent questions about enterprise security in the healthcare sector, and a recently retired federal judge named Warren, who had opinions about data sovereignty that were more technically informed than she'd expected. She was genuinely engaged. That was the thing Nathaniel, watching from 6 feet away, couldn't quite metabolize. She wasn't performing ease. She had it. The conversation at her end of the table had a warmth and a pull that drew others in, people leaning across their neighbors to catch something she'd said, the biotech executive laughing fully at something Evelyn followed up with. This was his wife. This was the woman who sat in her home office typing at things he'd never asked about, who made dinner on Tuesdays, who had handed him his coffee that morning with an expression of such perfect, even-keeled composure that he now understood had been a performance of the very best kind. Not deceptive exactly, but sealed, withheld. The face of someone who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the right moment to let the decision be visible. "She's remarkable," Constance was saying, half turned toward the table at large, and Nathaniel understood she was talking about Evelyn. "I've followed Cade Dynamics for 2 years without knowing anything about the person behind it. The DoD contract alone was a career's worth of work for most people." "She keeps a low profile," someone said. "Had," someone else corrected, and there was light laughter. Nathaniel drank more champagne. Vanessa put her hand briefly on his arm beneath the table. He registered it without responding to it. The touch felt like the most complicated thing in the room, which was saying something about the room. Across the table, Gerald Marsh was talking to one of the younger Hartwell Briggs associates, and even across the table noise, Nathaniel could make out the direction of it. Cade Dynamics, yes, the government work, and now the commercial platform. Extraordinary timing for this announcement. And the associate was nodding with the rapid attention of someone receiving information they understood was load-bearing. The evening was not going how he had planned. He looked down the table at Evelyn. She was listening to the federal judge, her head tilted slightly, her expression focused in the way that indicated she was actually processing what was being said rather than waiting for her turn to speak. She had always been a good listener. He had, at some point, filed that quality under passive rather than disciplined, which he was beginning to understand was one of the more catastrophic misreadings he'd made. The evening stretched ahead of him. Dessert, speeches, the foundation's presentation, the social hour after. He needed to manage this. That was the instinct that kicked in under pressure. The litigation reflex, the orientation toward control, even in situations where control was already gone. He needed to think about what people were seeing, what narrative they were building from what was in front of them, how to shape the way the night landed. He could say he knew. That was the first move. That he'd always known about the company. That he and Evelyn had kept their professional lives separate by mutual design. That, of course, he supported her. Had always supported her. And that her success was something he was enormously proud of. The problem with that story was Vanessa sitting 2 inches to his left. And the other problem was that the room had 300 people in it, and at least 30 of them knew him well enough to ask follow-up questions. And Gerald Marsh's expression across the table had already told him that the math wasn't going to hold. He reached for his champagne again. It was empty. He set it down. Evelyn, at that exact moment, glanced over at him. Not with anger, not with triumph. Just looked at him, steadily and briefly, with the composed, unreadable expression of a woman who had made a decision a long time ago and was simply watching it arrive. Then she looked back at the judge and said something that made the man smile. Nathaniel stared at his empty glass. The second course arrived. The third course arrived, and Nathaniel had still not decided what to do. That was the problem. Not the situation itself, which he'd handled worse in courtrooms with less preparation time, but the fact that for the first time in recent memory, he genuinely could not see the move. Every angle he turned the thing on revealed a new complication. Every story he considered constructing had a visible seam that someone at this table would find. He was a man who had spent 30 years building his ability to read rooms, and right now the room was reading him. He could feel it. The particular quality of attention that gathers when people sense that someone at the table is not as settled as they're presenting. Gerald Marsh had spoken to him twice in the last 20 minutes, both times cordially, both times with the measured warmth that Gerald deployed as a neutral instrument, neither warm enough to signal support nor cool enough to signal judgment. Just watching. Gerald was always just watching, and then one day you'd find out what he'd concluded, and there was nothing to be done about it. The Foundation's work in the Bronx has been remarkable, Constance was saying from Evelyn's right, and around her people nodded with the engaged sincerity that good causes produce in rooms full of people who can afford them. The STEM program specifically, the outcomes data from the last 3 years is extraordinary. Well, Evelyn's team actually consulted on the infrastructure for that program, Arthur Delacroix said from across the table, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has known something good was coming and has been waiting to say so. The security architecture for the student data systems. Pro bono. Several people looked at Evelyn. It was a small contribution, she said. The educators did the actual work. Modest, the federal judge Warren said, and smiled at her. Accurate, she said, and smiled back, and there was a brief warmth in the exchange that had nothing performed about it. Nathaniel cut into his food without tasting it. He was watching the room do something he'd seen rooms do before, but never with him as the specific object of it, the gradual reorientation of social gravity. It happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, the way tides move, the way people angled their bodies when they spoke, which conversations drew the most engagement, who people looked to when something interesting was said. The room was reorganizing itself around Evelyn, and it was doing so with the quiet conviction of a room that had decided she deserved it and hadn't needed to be told. He had not been erased from it. He was still Nathaniel Cross, still the man who might be announced as managing partner within the month, still a figure in this city's legal landscape that people recognized and respected. But the frame had changed. He had arrived at this event as its center of gravity in one small corner of the room, and now he was adjacent to something larger, and everyone at table 4 could feel the difference. He put down his fork, leaned toward Evelyn with the deliberate ease of a man who has decided to make a move even if he can't see all of its consequences. "You look incredible tonight," he said, quietly enough that it was addressed to her and not the table. She looked over at him with the expression of a woman who had expected this and had decided what it was worth. "Thank you, Nathaniel. I didn't know you were going to be here," he said. The admission came out before he could dress it differently, and he recognized it immediately as a mistake. Not because it was false, but because it confirmed in 2 seconds what he'd been trying to leave ambiguous. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking. I should have told you about tonight sooner, about bringing the firm." He was threading the needle badly, and he knew it. Things got complicated with the event logistics, and I should have been clearer. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. Not angry, not cold. The expression was something else. Patient, almost. The way you're patient with something that is doing exactly what you expected it to do. "You don't have to do that," she said. "I'm just saying, Nathaniel." Her voice was still quiet. "We can talk about whatever you want to talk about, but not right now, and not here." She glanced very briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward Vanessa, then back to him. "Enjoy your dinner." She turned back to Warren, who had been diplomatically focused on his own plate, and said something about a data sovereignty ruling from the year prior that clearly landed because the man straightened slightly and set down his fork with the readiness of someone who'd found an actual conversation. Nathaniel turned back to his own plate. Vanessa was rigid beside him. He could feel it without looking. The specific stillness of a woman who was keeping her composure by choice rather than by ease, whose jaw was set at a slightly unnatural angle. She hadn't spoken much since the entrance. When she did speak, it was to the person on her other side, carefully avoiding the end of the table where Evelyn sat. He needed to deal with that too. Not now. Everything was now. That was the problem. Gerald Marsh came to find him during the brief intermission before the Foundation's presentation. The 30-minute window when people rose from their tables and the room went back to being cocktail social, waitstaff clearing plates, the program booklet being consulted by people who hadn't looked at it yet. Nathaniel was standing near the windows when Gerald appeared beside him with the specific, unhurried walk of a man who had decided on a conversation and was not in a hurry because he held all the cards. "Hell of an evening," Gerald said, standing beside him with his own drink, looking out over the room with the practiced contentment of a man who genuinely enjoyed events like this. "It is," Nathaniel agreed. "Remarkable woman, your wife." Gerald said it without any particular inflection, which was more unsettling than if he'd said it with one. "I'll admit I was not aware of the scope of what she'd built. That's a significant company." "It is," Nathaniel said again. He heard how it sounded. 2 words, no added substance, which was the equivalent of arriving in court with no brief. "You never mentioned it," Gerald said. "We kept our professional lives separate. It was a mutual decision." Gerald was quiet for a moment, watching the room with the expression of a man who is deciding how much of what he's thinking to say out loud. Gerald Marsh was 64 years old and had made every kind of decision that could be made about when to speak and when to wait. And he had learned the hard way which category most situations belonged in. "I've known you a long time, Nathaniel," he said finally. "You have. Long enough to know when you're working a room and when the room has worked you." Gerald took a sip of his drink. "Tonight feels like the second one." Nathaniel said nothing. "The managing partner decision is still in front of us," Gerald continued, his tone shifting only slightly, less conversational, more deliberate. "That's real. Your record is what it is, and it's good. Nobody's disputing that." A pause. "But there are things that matter beyond the record. You know that. You've been in this firm long enough to know what the partners look at when they're deciding whether someone is going to represent them." "Gerald, I'm not here to have a difficult conversation," Gerald said mildly. "I'm here because I've been watching you for 20 years, and I have some regard for you. That regard is asking me to tell you that whatever is happening at table 4 tonight, whatever the situation is, the way you handle the next 2 hours is going to matter more than the last 6 months of work." He finished his drink, set the glass on a passing tray. "Your wife," he said, "is apparently extraordinary. Half this room is already looking up Cade dynamics on their phones. I just watched Harold Briggs ask Arthur Delacroix to arrange an introduction." He looked at Nathaniel directly for the first time in the conversation. "Think about what that means for you, and think about what the alternative means." He walked back toward the tables. Nathaniel stood at the window and stared out at Midtown Manhattan, where the lights ran to the horizon in every direction, indifferent to whatever was happening on the 3rd floor of the Caldwell. "Think about what that means for you." He was thinking about it. The problem was that the calculation kept coming up negative no matter how he ran it. If Evelyn was what the room now understood her to be, and she was, the room had understood it in about 4 seconds flat. Then the image of him that this evening had constructed was specific and not recoverable. A man who hadn't known. A man who had, in fact, brought a different woman to an event at which his wife turned out to be the most significant person in the building. Gerald hadn't said that out loud because Gerald didn't need to. It was ambient. Everyone at table 4 had put it together with the materials available. The question was what to do with the next 2 hours. He went back to the table. Vanessa met him at the edge of the seating area with a look that was managing itself very carefully. "I need to use the restroom," she said quietly. "I'll be back in a few minutes." It was not about the restroom. He understood that. She needed a moment outside the room to reassemble something, which was a reasonable thing to need, and he let her go without reaching for her arm or saying anything that would have made it harder. He watched her walk away. Then he turned toward table 4 and Evelyn, who was standing talking to Constance and another woman he didn't recognize, and made the decision to walk over. He had spent 30 years in situations where the options were bad, and the job was to find the one that was least bad. And that was what he was doing now. Not with any illusion that it was going to recover the evening, but with the residual professional instinct to engage rather than retreat. Evelyn saw him coming. Her expression didn't change, which was, he was learning, one of her primary social tools, the face that gave nothing away until she decided to give something. "Constance, would you excuse us for a moment?" Evelyn said, and Constance withdrew with the easy social grace of a woman who had sensed the current and knew when to step out of it. Nathaniel stood in front of his wife in the middle of the Lumina Foundation Gala and couldn't immediately locate a sentence. "You did this deliberately," he said finally. It came out without the judgment he'd intended to strip from it. "Yes," she said. "The sponsorship." "Yes." He absorbed that. "How long have you been planning it?" "The sponsorship? About 3 weeks." She paused. "The company?" "About 7 years." He looked at her. "Evelyn, I'm not angry, Nathaniel." She said it with a flatness that was worse than anger, the tone of something that has moved past the heat of it into the settled, cooler place on the other side. "I want you to understand that. This isn't revenge. I didn't build something for 7 years to use it as a weapon against you." "Then what is it?" She considered him for a moment. "It's mine," she said simply. "That's all it is. It was always mine, and tonight was the night it stopped being invisible." She glanced at the room around them, the standing conversations, the networking, the particular electricity of an event that had found its subject. "You removed me from the guest list, Nathaniel. You replaced my name with hers. And I think somewhere in you, you genuinely believed I wouldn't notice or wouldn't care, or—" She stopped. "That's the part I couldn't live with anymore. Not the affair, the invisibility." He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Don't tell me you knew about the company. Don't tell me you were proud of me, and just let me have my space with it. I know what our Tuesday dinner conversations looked like. I know what your face did when I tried to talk about my work." She looked at him with the clarity of someone who has rehearsed nothing and is simply telling the truth. "You had no idea. And the reason you had no idea is that you stopped looking." He stood there. He was, in the way that only completely accurate things can make a person, undone by how true it was. "I should have been better," he said, and heard it land as inadequate, and didn't try to improve on it. "Yes," she said, "you should have." A beat between them. The surrounding room moved, unaware. "What happens now?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "Tonight happens. And then we'll talk. Not here." She straightened slightly, a small gathering of herself that he recognized. The thing she did when she was closing a portion of a conversation that was finished. "But there are things I want to say to this room tonight, and then there are things I want to say to you privately, and I'd like to keep those two categories separate." He nodded. She turned back toward the table. He stood there for another second, not sure what he'd hoped to accomplish and not sure he'd accomplished it, and then walked back to his seat. Vanessa returned from the restroom with her composure rebuilt, visibly, effortfully built, the way you can tell a thing has been reconstructed rather than rested. She sat down beside Nathaniel and reached for her water and looked at the empty space above her plate where her dessert had been cleared. "I want to leave," she said very quietly. Not asking, informing. "Vanessa, I am not asking you to come with me," she said, with the precision of someone choosing words like surgical instruments. "I'm telling you I'm leaving. I'll take a cab." She set her water glass down. This was... She stopped herself, started again. "I didn't sign up for this specific situation. I didn't know she was going to be here," he said, low enough that it was only for her. "I understand that." She looked at him. "But she is. And the entire room knows exactly what the seating arrangement means, and I'm—" Her voice thinned slightly. "I have some dignity, Nathaniel. Even now." She picked up her evening bag. Stood. "Vanessa," he said. "I'll call you," she said, which meant she might or might not, and they both knew it. He watched her make her way around the outside of the room with the careful route of someone who wants to be seen leaving, but not seen fleeing. She was good at it. She made it look like an early exit rather than a retreat, stopping once to say something to someone she apparently recognized near the bar, and then she was out the door. The chair beside him was empty. He sat in it and looked at the tablecloth and thought about what Gerald had said, and what Evelyn had said, and what the room was seeing, and what it would go home and say. Across the table, Gerald Marsh had watched Vanessa leave. He looked at Nathaniel once. Then he picked up his dessert fork and resumed his conversation with the person beside him, and said nothing, and that nothing was louder than anything he could have said. Arthur Delacroix returned to the podium for the Foundation's formal presentation at 9:30. The room resettled, dinner finished, the particular good-natured readiness of a well-fed audience that knows the programming is short and the point is genuine. Delacroix spoke for 12 minutes about the Foundation's initiatives, clean, specific, the kind of presentation that respects the audience's time while earning their commitment. The screens at the front of the room showed photographs, data, faces of people whose lives had been changed. The room was quiet in the right way. Then Delacroix said, "Before I close, I want to give our principal sponsor the opportunity to speak. Not about her company, although what she's built is worth every minute of your attention, but about why she chose to be here tonight." He looked toward Evelyn and nodded. She rose without visible preparation, the way people do when they've thought about something long enough that the thinking is complete and what remains is just the doing of it. She walked to the podium, adjusted the microphone once, and looked out at the room. 300 people. Nathaniel Cross sat at his table and watched his wife stand in front of Manhattan's most influential gathering of the year and prepare to speak, and felt something that was not pride exactly. Not yet, not with everything else also present, but was perhaps its precursor. The raw material of a feeling his current circumstances couldn't quite assemble into its finished form. "I want to tell you something that isn't in any press release," Evelyn said. Her voice was clear, pitched with the natural authority of someone who'd spent years in conference rooms where being heard mattered. "I built Cade Dynamics in rooms that nobody looked in. Not because I was hiding, though I was, a little, for a time, but because I understood early that the work had to be the thing that justified itself. Not the story around it, not the relationships that surrounded it. The work." She paused. "That's hard to sustain. Doing something real and letting it be invisible while it grows. There are days when invisibility feels like freedom and days when it feels like erasure, and the difference between those two things is sometimes just the quality of your sleep." Quiet laughter from the room, the warm kind that says, "I know that feeling." But what I learned over 7 years of building something in rooms nobody visited is that the value of a thing doesn't change based on whether it's being witnessed. It just is what it is, and eventually, if it's real, the room comes to it. She let that sit for a moment. What this foundation does is the same work. It builds things in rooms that powerful people don't usually visit. It builds them anyway. And it trusts that if the work is real, eventually the room will come. She looked across the faces in front of her. "I'm honored to be part of that trust, and I'm grateful to everyone in this room who puts money and attention and time behind things that are real, even when they're invisible." She stepped back from the microphone. The applause was immediate and genuine, the kind that starts before people have decided to clap, the involuntary kind. 2 tables rose again, then a third. Nathaniel sat at table 4 with his hands flat on the tablecloth and his eyes fixed on his wife at the front of the room, and understood, with the slow-moving certainty of something that has been true for a long time and has just now become impossible to not see, that he had profoundly and completely failed to know the person he'd been married to. Not misunderstood. Not underestimated. Failed. There was a difference, and he was standing inside it. The room moved into its post-program phase, the last stretch of the evening when the formal structure relaxes and the social networking reasserts itself, people rising from tables, refilling drinks, consolidating the conversations they'd started during cocktail hour. Evelyn was, immediately, surrounded. There was no other word for it. The moment she returned from the podium, people came to her. Not in a rushing, overwhelming wave, but in the steady, purposeful way that indicates genuine interest rather than social performance. The biotech executive Constance, who had already exchanged cards with her at dinner. 2 people from the tables adjacent to the foundation circle who introduced themselves as investors in adjacent technology sectors. A woman whose name Nathaniel recognized from financial media, who was asking Evelyn something with the focused attention of someone conducting a very informal interview. Arthur Delacroix hovered at the edge, the pleased expression of a man who has connected the right guests and is watching it pay out. Harold Briggs reached her at about 9:55. 81 years old, Harold Briggs was not a man who moved across rooms to meet people. People moved to meet him. It was a social physics that had governed his presence at these events for 40 years. and that everyone in the Hartwell-Briggs orbit understood as a fixed law. Nathaniel watched Harold Briggs cross the room to Evelyn Cade. He stood up without having decided to. Harold reached her and extended his hand and said something that made Evelyn smile. A real smile, not the social one. And Evelyn shook his hand and said something back, and Harold laughed, actually laughed, which was a sound Nathaniel had heard maybe 4 times in 2 decades. He started walking toward them. He wasn't sure what he was going to say. He had a dim instinctive sense that his proximity to this conversation was important, that the managing partner calculus that Gerald had described was operating in real time, and that being physically absent from the most important exchange happening in the room was a form of self-destruction he couldn't afford. He reached them. Harold looked at him. "Nathaniel?" Harold said pleasantly. "Harold!" He stood there, looked at Evelyn. "I see you've met my wife." Harold glanced between them with the expression of a man who has been in enough rooms to understand exactly what the architecture of this particular one meant. He said, very simply, "Indeed I have. She's been explaining what Cade Dynamics does." He turned back to Evelyn. "I understand you're launching something new, soon." "Tonight, actually," Evelyn said. "The press release goes at midnight. A new platform. Enterprise-level, adaptive architecture. We've been in development for almost 2 years." "Midnight tonight," Harold repeated. He seemed to find this amusing in the way that very old, very experienced people find audacity amusing. Not with surprise, but with recognition. "You planned this." "The timing was convenient," she said. Harold looked at Nathaniel again. "You must be very proud," he said. The sentence had weight. Not malicious weight. Harold Briggs was not a malicious man, but the weight of a real question buried in a social statement, the kind that had only one correct answer and several possible ways to miss it. "I am," Nathaniel said. And then, because the moment demanded more than reflexive agreement, and he knew it, he said, "I'm also sorry I haven't said it to her directly and loudly before now." Evelyn looked at him. Harold looked at him. The statement sat in the air between all 3 of them, with the uncomfortable solidity of something true that has been said in a place where true things are rarely said. Harold nodded, once, with the measured approval of a man who has seen a great many people choose badly in high-pressure moments and has noted the exception. Then he said to Evelyn, "I'd like to have breakfast with you next week, if you're open to it." "I'd be glad to," she said. Harold moved away. Nathaniel stood in the space Harold had occupied. Evelyn was watching him with the same clear, undecorated attention she'd been watching him with all evening. "That wasn't for the audience," he said. "What I just said." "I know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway, outside of this room, whenever you want to have that conversation." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a woman doing a calculation that wasn't simple and wasn't quick. Not cold, not warm. Honest. "I know you mean that right now," she said. "In this room, in this moment, with everything you've seen tonight." She paused. "What I don't know is whether you'll still mean it at 9 o'clock Tuesday morning when you're back in your office and none of this is in front of you." He had no answer to that. Which was, he understood, the answer. "We'll talk," she said. "I meant that." She turned to greet the next person waiting to speak with her. He stood there for another moment, and then he went back to his table and sat in the chair where Vanessa had been, and looked at the room that had reorganized itself without his permission, and thought about what Gerald had said, and what Harold had said, and what Evelyn had said, and the thing underneath all of it that he hadn't yet found words for but could feel moving in him like something that had been still for a long time and was finally, at considerable cost, starting to wake up. At 11:47, the first phone started lighting up. It was quiet at first. 1 or 2 people glancing at screens with the slightly guilty discretion of guests who know it's bad form but can't help it. Then more. Then the particular contagious awareness spread through the room that something was happening outside it, and people began to look. The Cade Dynamics press release had gone live 8 minutes early. Cade Dynamics announces Secure Grid. Apex, the next generation of adaptive enterprise security. The headline ran across screens. Within 60 seconds, 3 separate financial media push notifications had fired. The Wall Street Journal's technology desk had already posted a pre-written piece timed to the embargo lift. Bloomberg had 2 reporters' bylines up within the first 5 minutes. Nathaniel watched it happen the way you watch a weather system arrive. Something you can see coming, that you've been told to expect, that is still larger than you prepared for. Table by table, the room understood what it was holding. The woman in the black dress with the silver threading, standing across the ballroom accepting a business card from the city councilwoman, had just launched the most discussed technology product of the year, on the same night she'd walked into a room as its most important guest, in the building where her husband had planned to crown himself and had instead watched himself become peripheral. Gerald Marsh appeared at Nathaniel's shoulder. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood there holding his drink, watching the room respond to the news. Then he said very quietly, "The partners are going to have a conversation next week that I think is going to go differently than you expected." Nathaniel looked at him. "Not because of tonight," Gerald said, "because of what tonight showed us about the last several years, about what was happening inside your own house while you were asking us for the keys to ours." He didn't say it cruelly. He said it the way a surgeon describes a thing that is going to hurt, accurately, without embellishment, because embellishment would be a disservice. "I need you to hear that," Gerald said, "and to think about what you want to do with the next chapter, because there's still a next chapter. There usually is." He walked away. Nathaniel Cross stood in the middle of the Lumina Foundation Gala and looked at his wife across the room. Evelyn Cade, principal sponsor, tech founder, the most interesting person at the party, while every phone in the building lit up with her name. She caught his eye once, briefly, and looked away first. The gala ended at midnight with the particular deflation that formal events have when the structure that held them dissolves. Waitstaff moving efficiently through the room, guests gathering coats and cards, and the conversational threads they wanted to carry out into the city, the overhead lights coming up by incremental degrees that told everyone the evening had made its decision and it was time to go. Evelyn stayed until the room was mostly empty. She wasn't avoiding anything. She simply had no reason to rush, which was a feeling she'd earned and intended to inhabit fully. Constance had taken her card and promised a call next week about a potential partnership in health sector security infrastructure. Harold Briggs' assistant had already sent a calendar invitation for Tuesday breakfast. Harold himself, apparently, did not wait. The councilwoman had spent 20 minutes in a conversation about municipal data systems that had started as networking and ended as genuine interest. The Wall Street Journal reporter had requested a formal interview, which Marcus, who had been monitoring the launch from the office, had already triaged and scheduled. She stood near the entrance as the last guest filtered out, talking to Arthur Delacroix and his deputy, a young woman named Sandra, who had managed the event's logistics, and who looked simultaneously exhausted and satisfied in the way that only people who do difficult things well look at the end of a long day. "This was the best one we've done," Arthur said, "not for the first time, but sincerely each time. I don't say that lightly. The room felt different tonight." "Rooms change when people tell the truth in them," Sandra said, with the frankness of someone who'd been up since 5 that morning and had temporarily lost her filter. She caught herself and looked at Evelyn with a flicker of professional alarm. Evelyn smiled. "That's exactly right," she said. Sandra relaxed. She said her goodbyes to Arthur, hugged Sandra briefly, an impulsive warmth that surprised them both, and walked out through the Caldwell's lobby into the night air. The car was waiting at the curb. She stood beside it for a moment and breathed in the city. November air, faintly metallic, the particular smell of Manhattan after an event when the dressed-up people have dispersed and the street has reclaimed itself. Somewhere down the block, a restaurant was still going. A couple walked past, arguing mildly about something that sounded inconclusive. A cab cut through the intersection with the aggressive confidence that cabs in this city maintain regardless of the hour. She got in the car. She did not go home. At 12:40 in the morning, Marcus Webb opened his office door and found Evelyn in the corridor outside, still in the gown, heels in hand, walking barefoot on the industrial carpet of the Cade Dynamics 43rd floor in the way that people do when they've had enough of being formal and haven't yet decided what to be instead. "You didn't have to come in," he said. "I wanted to see it," she said. He stepped back and led her into the office. The monitors were running, the launch coverage, the social media response, the financial press. Dara was there, coffee in hand, sitting sideways in a chair the way she always sat when she was tired, with her shoes off and her jacket draped over the back. Two members of the communications team were at their desks across the room, looking up when Evelyn walked in with the particular expression of people who'd been rooting for something and had watched it land. Dara looked at her for a long moment. "Well?" she said. Evelyn looked at the screens. The coverage was significant, was the accurate word, though it didn't quite hold the weight of what she was looking at. The Wall Street Journal piece had 11,000 shares in 40 minutes. Bloomberg's analysis had framed Secure Grid Apex as the most consequential enterprise security launch of the decade, which was aggressive, but not, by her assessment, wrong. A tech analyst she respected had gone on record within the first hour, calling it a category-defining product. 3 separate venture capital firms had contacted Marcus directly with inquiries before midnight and threaded through all of it, in every piece, in every mention, the company's name, her name, Evelyn Cade, founder. Built this. She stood and looked at it and felt something she didn't immediately have a word for. Not triumph. Triumph was a hot feeling, and this was something cooler, more sustained. Not relief, for relief implied she'd been afraid, and she hadn't been afraid so much as she'd been patient for a very long time, in a way that takes energy that relief doesn't fully account for. What she felt, most accurately, was finished. In the sense of something completed, like a structure that has been under construction for years and is now, for the first time, fully itself. 7 years, Dara said quietly. 7 years, Evelyn agreed. Marcus handed her a coffee. She took it and stood at the window, looking out at the city with the monitors running behind her and her team around her, and let the moment be what it was. She didn't try to manage it or compress it into something useful or move past it prematurely. She just stood in it. The DoD reached out, Marcus said after a moment. Their liaison wants a briefing call for Monday to discuss what Apex means for the existing contract parameters. Schedule it. 4 media requests overnight. 2 are worth your time. I'll have a summary in the morning. Okay. Harold Briggs' office. I already have the Tuesday breakfast, she said. Marcus nodded, paused. How was the rest of the evening? She turned from the window. The question was specific in a way that wasn't about the launch, and they both knew it. Complicated, she said. And clear, both at once. He accepted that. Marcus was good at accepting the answers he got, and not pressing for the ones he wanted. It was one of his better qualities, and she'd told him so once, and he'd said I had to get bad at something to get good at that without elaborating, and she'd understood. She stayed for another hour, not working exactly, but present, in the way that leaders sometimes need to be simply present in the spaces they've built, talking to the communications team about the morning's follow-up sequencing, reading the analyst coverage with the particular attention of someone whose opinion of their own work is more demanding than anyone else's, and who is searching for the gap between what was built and what was understood. Finding, with quiet satisfaction, that the gap was smaller than it had been for any previous launch. At 2 a.m, she took her heels off the desk where she'd set them and put them back on and said goodnight. Dara walked her to the elevator. Are you going home? Dara asked. Yes. Is he there? Probably. Dara pressed the elevator button. They stood in the corridor in the particular quiet of a building after hours, the city's hum audible through the glass at a frequency that was almost soothing. For what it's worth, Dara said, whatever you decide, about all of it, you're not deciding it from a place of nothing anymore. You're deciding it from here. She gestured back at the office, at the monitors, at the 43rd floor that Evelyn had built and filled and made real. You have ground to stand on. Evelyn looked at her. I always had ground to stand on. I know, Dara said, but now it shows. The elevator arrived. Evelyn got in. She rode down alone, watching the floor numbers decrease, and thought about what Dara had said, and what Evelyn had said back, and which one was more true. Both, probably. That was the honest answer. Both things were true, and they didn't cancel each other out. And that was the complicated thing about clarity. It didn't simplify. It just made the complications visible and required you to deal with them as they were, rather than as you'd been able to pretend they weren't. But Nathaniel was home. She saw the light in the living room from the hallway. He was still up, which surprised her slightly. It was after 2, and Nathaniel was a disciplined sleeper, a man who treated rest as professional maintenance and was generally in bed by 11 on weeknights. The light meant he'd waited. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She set her bag down, took off the heels for the last time, walked to the living room doorway. He was sitting on his couch with a glass of whiskey and no television, which was unusual enough to be notable. He looked up when she came in. He hadn't changed out of the navy suit. His tie was loosened and his jacket was across the arm of the couch, and he had the particular look of a man who has been sitting with his own thoughts for long enough that they've become company he's not fully comfortable with. "You went to the office," he said. "I wanted to see the launch coverage." He nodded. "How was it?" "Significant," she said. He looked down at his glass. "I've been reading it," he said, "on my phone, for the last 2 hours." He paused. "The journal piece, Bloomberg, the analyst responses." She came into the room and sat in the chair across from him. Not beside him, not at a removing distance, but at the conversational distance of two people who need to be able to see each other's faces. "Okay," she said. "I didn't know," he said. "I want to say that again, outside of the room, without anyone watching. I did not know what you'd built, the scope of it, what it was." He looked at her. "I thought I knew what you did. I thought it was consulting work that you were good at and that mattered to you, and I handled that badly. I treated it like something I didn't need to understand. And that was," he stopped. "That was wrong. Not just strategically wrong. Wrong." She listened. She'd learned over 11 years to listen for the difference between Nathaniel performing honesty and Nathaniel actually being honest. And the difference was specific. Something in the rhythm of it. Something in whether the sentences were organized for persuasion or just organized for truth. This felt like the second kind. She wasn't entirely sure what to do with that. "I also know," he said, "that saying it now is late. That you could reasonably tell me that I'm only saying it because the room watched me not say it for years and that the timing is too convenient to mean anything." "I could tell you that," she agreed. "Is it what you think?" She considered it, honestly, the way she did with herself when she was in the mood for accuracy rather than comfort. "I think you mean it right now," she said. "I think tonight was real for you. I think watching the room understand something about your wife that you'd failed to understand is a specific and uncomfortable experience that produces a specific kind of reckoning." She paused. "I don't know what you'll mean in 2 weeks." "Neither do I," he said. That surprised her. The admission. She'd expected more scaffolding, more of the architecture of reassurance that he was genuinely gifted at building. The bare admission was different. "Evelyn," he said, "what do you want to happen?" She sat with the question. It was the question she'd been living inside for longer than the 3 weeks of gala planning. It predated the email with the guest list. It predated the company, in some form. It was the question underneath all the other questions, underneath why she'd kept Cade Dynamics invisible, why she'd stopped trying to bring him into it, why she'd let the distance between their two lives grow to the dimensions it had grown to without doing anything to close it. She had been answering it, in action, for years. She had built an answer. She had stepped into a room in a black dress and delivered an answer. But this version of the question, "What do you want to happen?" was asking about what came next. And what came next was less clear than anything that had already occurred. "I want to be seen," she said. "I want to be in a relationship where the person across the table is actually curious about me. Not performing curiosity, actually curious. Wanting to know." She looked at him. "I don't know if that's possible between you and me. I don't know if the years of not being that for each other are something we can undo or build on top of, or whether they've just determined what this is. Do you want to find out?" "I don't know," she said. "That's the honest answer. I don't know, and I'm done saying things I'm not sure of to make the conversation easier." He nodded slowly. "That's fair." "It's not about fair," she said. It's about what's true." They sat in the living room at 2:30 in the morning in a silence that was not comfortable and not hostile. It was the silence of two people who have finally said the actual things and are sitting in the space those things have made, which is necessarily larger and colder than the space that was there before. "The affair," she said. "Vanessa." He looked at her directly. "It's over. It was over before tonight. I want you to know that, not because it makes tonight better, but because it's true." "How long?" 8 months. She absorbed that. 8 months was specific, and that specificity was its own small violence. Not the worst number, but not a short time either, long enough to have been a decision rather than a mistake, long enough to have required maintenance. Were there others? A pause. One. 3 years ago. It ended. She looked at her hands for a moment. She had suspected at various points, without ever pressing for confirmation, which was perhaps its own answer about the state things had been in for years. Hearing it confirmed was not a surprise. It was still a weight. I'm not going to pretend those things don't matter, she said. They do. I know. And I'm not going to make a decision tonight about what I want to do with them. I'm too tired and it's too late and we've both had enough of this evening. Okay, he said. What I will tell you is that I'm not disappearing. I'm not going to be quiet about what I've built or what I want or what I need in my life. If something continues between us, it continues on ground that's different from what we've been standing on. She looked at him steadily. I don't know if you can actually want that. I think you believe you want it right now. But wanting it right now and wanting it on a Tuesday morning 3 months from now are different things. You keep saying that, he said. Tuesday morning. Because that's when it becomes real, she said. Not at galas. Not at 2 a.m. after the best professional night of my life. In the ordinary hours, when nothing is dramatic and nobody's watching. That's where it's true, or it isn't. He looked at her for a long time. Then let me try to be there, he said, on the Tuesday mornings. Let me try to actually show up in those hours. And if I fail, he stopped. If I fail, I'll know it, and you'll know it, and we'll deal with it honestly. She looked at him. She thought about what Ruth had said. He had just had his eyes closed, and what that implied, which was that closed was not the same as gone. And she thought about what she herself had said at the podium. The value of a thing doesn't change based on whether it's being witnessed, and what that implied about the question of what was worth rebuilding and what wasn't. She didn't know. That was the truest thing she could hold. She did not know. And she was tired enough of pretending to know things she didn't that she was going to let that be enough for tonight. Go to sleep, she said. We'll talk more when we're not both running on nothing. He got up. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment and looked at her with the expression of a man who has more things he wants to say and has decided correctly that tonight is not the container for them. Evelyn, he said. She looked up. What you said tonight, at the podium. He paused. It was true. All of it. She held his gaze. I know, she said. He went upstairs. She sat alone in the living room for another 20 minutes, not thinking about anything in particular, letting the night settle around her. Then she turned off the living room light and went to the window and stood looking out at the city the way she'd stood at 4 that morning. The same view, the same grid, the same refusal to be quiet even at this hour. But something was different in how she was standing in front of it. She was visible now. Not to the city, which had always been indifferent to any individual standing at any particular window looking out at it, but to herself, in the way that doing a thing you have been building toward for years makes you finally legible to yourself, like a word you've been trying to read in bad light and have finally moved close enough to understand. She went to bed. Set. The Tuesday morning came. Not the Tuesday after. The world doesn't resolve on that schedule. But eventually Tuesday came, as Tuesdays do, without ceremony or announcement, ordinary in all the ways that ordinary days are ordinary. Nathaniel came down to the kitchen at 8 and found Evelyn at the island with her laptop and her coffee, which was the same image he'd seen 10,000 mornings. But the morning was different because he was different in it, or was trying to be, which was not the same thing, and he knew it. How do you take your coffee? He asked. He was standing at the machine. She looked up. It was such a simple question that it was almost absurd. 11 years, and he was asking how she took her coffee. But it was the right question, which was the point. Not how he thought she took it, or how he remembered from years ago, or how he assumed without checking. Black, she said, with exactly 1 sugar. He made it correctly. He set it beside her laptop and sat down across from her and said, What are you working on? She told him. He asked a question, not the polite, reflexive question of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but a question that came from actually listening, that required her to say something she hadn't said yet. She answered it. He asked another. They sat at the kitchen island for 40 minutes before either of them moved. It was not a transformation. It was a conversation between two imperfect people who had let years go to waste and were standing in the wreckage of that and choosing, on this particular Tuesday, to pick something up. Whether they would keep choosing that on the next Tuesday and the one after that, through the actual difficult negotiations of two lives that had grown in different directions, was not determined and was not the point. The point was the 40 minutes. The formal separation paperwork was drawn up 6 weeks later, not because the Tuesday mornings had failed. Some of them had not, which was its own complicated truth, but because they'd both arrived in separate rooms at separate moments at the same honest conclusion that what they had been to each other had cost too much, and that what they might become wasn't worth more than what they would have to become to get there. That was the math, and it was the kind of math you can only do clearly when you've stopped needing a particular answer. The conversation where they told each other was quiet, painful in the specific way that things are painful when they're true rather than unfair. A clean pain, if there's such a thing, the kind that comes from the honest ending of something that had been ending for a long time. They sat at the kitchen table. "I think this is right," Nathaniel said. "I think so too," she said. "I don't want it to be," he said. "Neither do I." She paused. "But wanting something to be different isn't the same as it being different." He nodded. His eyes were tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the guest list, for Vanessa, for the years of not looking." She believed him. That was the complicated part. She believed him, and it didn't change the conclusion, and that was one of the harder things she'd ever had to sit with. Regret and accountability and genuine remorse on one side, and the accumulated weight of what had been on the other, and neither of them canceling the other out, just existing together in the same space, the way real endings do. "I know you are," she said. The lawyers handled the rest. The apartment went on the market in the spring. Evelyn moved into a place in Hudson Yards, 2 floors below the Cade Dynamics offices. Not a statement, just practical, which was how she'd always made the best decisions. Nathaniel took a sublet in the West Village while the apartment sold and began the particular hard work of rebuilding a professional reputation in a city that had watched his wife outgrow him in public, which was not a gentle experience but was, ultimately, an education. The managing partner vote happened 7 weeks after the gala. Gerald Marsh called him the afternoon of the vote, with the measured delivery of a man who has practiced this kind of call enough to do it with both accuracy and decency. "It was close," Gerald said. "But no," Nathaniel said. "But no," Gerald confirmed. The partners felt, and I'm including myself in this, that the circumstances of the gala raised questions about judgment that we weren't prepared to set aside. Not about your legal work. Your legal work remains excellent. About other things. Nathaniel sat at his desk and looked at his window. Outside, the city was doing its midday thing. Cabs, pedestrians, the ordinary machinery of a place that does not pause for any individual's disappointment. "Is this permanent?" he asked. "No," Gerald said. "Not permanent. A year, maybe 2. You do the work, you handle things well, the conversation reopens." A pause. "I want that for you, Nathaniel. I want you to understand that." "I know you do, Gerald." "And for what it's worth," Gerald said after a moment, "what you said to Harold that night, about being sorry you hadn't said it louder, sooner. I heard that. Several people heard it. It wasn't nothing." Nathaniel spent a long time on the phone after the call ended, just holding it, looking at the window. Then he put it down and opened his computer and went back to work. There was nothing else to do. That was the thing about the aftermath of spectacular failures. There's no ceremony for them, no formal moment of reckoning. You just go back to work. You carry it with you, and it changes the shape of how you move through the hours. And if you're honest with yourself, you let it change the shape of how you move through your life. And you don't get to know for a long time whether the change was enough. Evelyn was on a panel in San Francisco the first week of February, a tech leadership conference that she'd turned down 3 consecutive years and had finally accepted because the timing was right, and because she was done declining things that were meant for her. The moderator asked, near the end, the question that moderators always ask at events like this. What's the thing you know now that you wish you'd known earlier? The other panelists gave polished answers. Fail fast, trust your instincts, build your network. Good answers, useful answers, the kind of answers that travel well in quotes. Evelyn thought about it. She thought about a kitchen island on a Tuesday morning and 40 minutes of her husband asking actual questions. She thought about a ballroom in Midtown and silver threading that moved with the light. She thought about 7 years of building in rooms no one visited, and the specific quality of the silence in those rooms, which had not always felt like freedom and had not always felt like erasure, but had sometimes, on the best days, felt like exactly enough. I wish I'd understood sooner, she said, that being invisible and being unseen are completely different things. She looked at the audience, a few hundred people, most of them younger than her, most of them at the beginning of something. Invisible is a choice, a strategy, sometimes a good one. Unseen is what happens when the people in your life stop looking. She paused. One of those is in your control. The other one, you can't fix by working harder or building bigger. You can only decide whether you're willing to live inside it. The room was quiet for a moment. Then someone in the back started clapping, and it spread, and Evelyn sat with it and let it be what it was. After the panel, she called Ruth. "How was it?" Ruth asked. "Good," Evelyn said. "Really good, actually." "You sound different," Ruth said. "Do I?" "Like yourself," Ruth said. "You sound like yourself." Evelyn stood outside the conference venue in the February San Francisco air, which was cold and clean and faintly salt-tinged from the bay a mile away, and thought about that, like yourself. It had taken a long time. It had cost more than she'd expected and less than she'd feared. There had been mornings that were harder than the gala, because the gala had been one night with a clear shape and an ending, and the mornings after were just days, unstructured, without drama, without anyone watching, requiring her to be exactly who she was, with no occasion to justify it. She had been doing that, badly and then better, since November. She still worked too late. She still had the habit of carrying problems home in her head instead of setting them down at the door, which Dara had called out twice in the past month with the frankness of a person who'd earned the right. She still sometimes caught herself in a meeting performing a version of steadiness she wasn't entirely feeling, the old muscle memory of keeping the interior separate from the exterior, and had to consciously let the two things be closer together. She was imperfect at the life she was building. That was the honest assessment, but she was building it. "Yeah," she told Ruth. "I think I do." She stood in the cold for another minute, looking at the bay glittering in the distance with the particular quality of winter light on water, which is not the same as summer light and is, in certain moods, more beautiful for it, more spare, more specific, nothing softened, everything exactly what it is. Then she put her phone in her pocket and went back inside. There was more work to do, and she was not finished, and she had stopped needing to be.